Hey Ian,
Hi, Jordy.
I looking forward to part two of this webinar that
Sure.
we're going to finish up today on is really one of those fundamental ones. We talked a little bit about planning for adult children. Now we're going to finish that up. Some fundamental concerns anytime we're planning for adult children, even though it might seem quite simple. We're going to finish up on residue gifts to adult children, picking executors, and then planning for younger or less capable beneficiaries. So if we are good to go, we can get right into the whole gifting of residue to adult children.
Let's go.
All right. So first thing is, we're talking about pretty typical planning here. Do we have a need to name children specifically? Should we just use a class description? My personal view, because I define children in my wills, if everyone could just make sure they're muted, that would be great. Um, because I use a definition of children in my wills so that there's no confusion, I am comfortable with using the term children. Um, but other people prefer, do you have any views on that, Ian? Does it matter or?
Oh no, I think it matters, and it's I think crucial, and that's where you tie it up with the definitions piece, so you don't get into interpretation problems.
Especially if somebody's been treated as a child. And because it comes down to, if you use just the word my children, it's a question of interpretation, unless you're specific about it. And so, if the testator meant when they said my children, those people I treat as my children, then arguably they're beneficiaries as well. And so that's why we prefer at some point defining who we mean by these beneficiaries. The next topic is really, okay, are we treating the kids equally? And sometimes we assume that off the top, and it's often a question that I'll ask, are we treating everybody equally here? And of course, if you're not, then you're going to draft accordingly and plan out accordingly. So that's kind of a pretty standard question. The third one, though, is something that, and we've talked about this before, we've done a whole webinar on the whole idea of advances and gifts and loans and things to children. But, and we'll just touch on it briefly here, but this is one which is very, very common and yet so commonly overlooked by many of us. So one of the questions that I would always want to ask, and if you use eState, you'll know it prompts you about this, is are there any gifts or advances that we should be aware of, and whether they're going to be treated as just gifts and we forget them, or are they going to be counted against the share of an adult child in a hodgepodge kind of idea? Either way, knowing about them is really, really important. Ian, you've seen hundreds of these issues, right?
Yeah, and I just think it's one of these things that we don't want to underestimate the fact that some kids, some of your children might be your clients' children might be actually quite noses out of joint, but they're not telling you. Situations where and it's difficult, right? When some kids need money at certain stages in life, and some kids don't, and so you may be pouring in money under one side of the equation, and because they need to be, higher spending. I don't know, rent for Toronto or something, and you're subsidizing the rent in Toronto, and you don't want to. I always like to go talking through with my clients and say, "Well, okay, is that bothering the other two siblings? That particular son or daughter is getting some subsidy, so to speak, and is it because it adds up?" And it opens you up to at least the discussion, because sometimes clients just say, "Oh, I presume that's not going to be bothering my kids," and you say, "Well, maybe you want to have that discussion offline and just come back to us, and we can easily hodgepodge it or forgive it in the will. But we'd like to. You may want to address it now with your kids."
Yeah, and it's one of those things that parents certainly underestimate, and it's the first thing that kids know. I always joke that every child knows exactly. They can't really remember what they received from their parents, but they know exactly what their siblings received. And without having a note in your file about that you've discussed this and even documented it or confirmed with the client that everything that you've given, they're not keeping track and they treat them all as gifts. That is, crucial to have in your file, because it's such a common situation, and it's often the very first thing that comes to the fore, right? Everyone's treated the same. Yeah, well, then that's okay. It's no problem. Well, not if, kids have their own views on things. And then just briefly about, this again, we're talking about adult to absolute kid gifts to adult children, the giftovers. And it's very common to say if a child's not alive, then to their kids or their issue, per stirpes. And just remembering, obviously, to have some sort of trust provision for grandchildren who might inherit in this kind of situation. Again, you probably, for eState users, we have the beneficiaries under a certain age clause that automatically it goes in there, and you can set the age at which a grandchild might inherit. If you're dealing with a large estate and a child, there's only two children and one of them has kids, those grandchildren are probably going to, it will inherit a big amount if the child dies. And are the trust provisions in the will satisfactory? We see, Ian, you see this all the time, I'm sure, about, there's no trust provision except any child under, any minors, it gets held to 18. Well, they've inherited $3 million, so.
Yeah, and I always say to my clients in these situations, it's like, so you're going to the trouble of doing a will, and you're trying to, factor in as many of the alternatives as possible. And then the scenario is that they're going to get Corvettes if God forbid, one of your adult children dies. Just seems to be lazy planning.
Yeah. And the last thing is, sometimes clients say, well, if my son's not alive, I'd want some portion to go to my daughter-in-law, or all of it to go to my daughter-in-law, or something like that. Where that's the case, you may want to talk to the client about what happens is that kind of conditional on the daughter-in-law, for example, in my case, not have been separated from your son when your son died or something like that. And so again, that's a clause that eState does automatically. It sees if you're giving a gift to a child's spouse and puts in a condition automatically, which you can again change. But that's another thing to put on your checklist if you don't have it on already. So I'm going to turn this over to you a bit, Ian, on, what do you think about picking executors? We have adult children. What are your thoughts? Do we pick all the children? What are some of the issues there and making decisions and et cetera?
Well, this is the great joy of practicing law with you, is that you and I have a philosophical difference on this one. And when I'm in meetings with you, I just bite my tongue. But you tend to be all the children approach. I notice if I was to put a pattern of your advice, you're a big fan of putting all the children in, and I'm a bigger fan of saying to the client, let's have a reasoned discussion about this. Is that really going to be a good idea? And if you can talk to your children before. Maybe it does make sense that one of them is the executor and that you've sort of soft landed it. Obviously, you give the same advice. I'm just kidding, but you definitely have a really good approach, and that is, hey, let's not create any fight here. Let's put all the kids in there, and make them work themselves out, so that no nose is out of joint. And so it really so much depends on the nature of the assets that are going to be administered. And so from my perspective anyway, both approaches are of course worth exploring with your client. And obviously in a larger family of 5 or 6 kids or something like that, which we don't see as often, that's probably not a position A, but 2 or 3 kids, it may make best sense not to put anyone's nose on a joint and just put them all in there, and it'll kind of force them to work together.
The way I approach is, let's start with the approach where everybody's included, and let's work backwards from there. And let's think through why that wouldn't be a good approach. And look, it's not perfect by any stretch, but I would rather start from that approach and then work down and then talk to the client about, make sure this is not necessarily a surprise to everybody. You know, most disputes occur not challenging the validity of a will, but the feelings that are hurt by power dynamics. And this is, listen, there's no better statement from or evidence of a statement from a parent than I trust you more than your sibling because I'm appointing you as the decision maker. But if you're not going to include all the children, I'm always want to be careful about compensation, first of all, and not, there's no right answer here, but making sure that I ask the client, listen, you're only appointing one kid. Should they be compensated or not? If they're compensated, they're going to end up with more money than your other kids. If they're not compensated, they're going to end up with more work than the other kids, unpaid labor. And so there's no right or wrong answer, but it's something to discuss because that often can be an issue if not all kids are appointed. And I'll get your comment on that in 1 second. And then the second thing is just examine the will and look at the amount of discretion that the executors have and whether that is going to still work with only one. So in other words, if one kid can decide how personal effects are going to get distributed, are you okay with that kind of thing? Comments on that, and then we're going to move to the minor and younger children.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered the same things that I think about in that issue. It's just it is really the one issue that I say to my clients. That's the one thing. If you're not prepared to tell your clients about everything, your kids about everything you're doing in the will, choice of executor, that's worth having that discussion. You don't have to get into the distributions and your gifting if you don't want to. You want to keep it private, but the choice of executor is a good one.
Yeah. So let's talk now about not fully capable children. So we're talking about minors, or we're talking about children who are younger and might not want, your clients might not want them to get all the money at once, right? As we talked about at the outset, if your clients are using the word "but" to describe a gift, we're talking about trusts here. And the "but" in this case is I want my kids to get money, but not till they're X years old, for example. And so whenever we talk about a trust, whether it's for children or anyone, we're really thinking about only a few major issues. The first one is really the duration. And the second one is how payments are going to come out from the trust to the beneficiaries until the trust is over. And so those are the two kind of fundamental things that we talk about. Anyway, Ian, did you have any thoughts on that? And then we'll get into the sort of argument about the same but different buts and those kinds of.
Well, just a quick point. I mean, I think certainly duration's always something that some people want to go at 25, some money, and then 30, a little bit of the rest, or hold on longer or shorter. But I do think the concept of payments ties in the whole question of discretion and the level of discretion you're going to give them. Are we going to give them the power to encroach and so on? And so, those are the two starting points. And I like eState because it forces me to go into the program and say, okay, again, I want duration. I want variables on these choices that forces me to walk through the client's direct input, because this is a personal choice that they like to have. And it's one that's worth spending the time on.
Fundamental question is, do all the children have the same but? And, if all the children, now, sometimes the same but are actually different buts. So if I've got 3 kids, one who's 10, one who's 15, and one who's 20, and everyone gets their equal share at 30, one kid may have to wait a lot longer, even though it's reaching the same age as their sibling. One's going to have to wait a lot longer. So that's the idea of, everyone looks on paper to be the same, but the effect is different. So that's why, sometimes people deal with different buts. We'll say, it's a certain period of time after death, or those kinds of things. And it's a debate that people have about what's fair, because it looks equal, but what's fair? And so that's something to consider. And just sometimes you've got situations, Ian, and I know you've seen this, one kid's more capable than another kid, right? And so one kid would be fine to get their money at 25. The other one, you'd say, I want a 30 for this kid, 25 for that. What's your thought on that? Do you have any thoughts on talking to clients through that issue?
Well, I think of it the other day when I was watching, there's a new book out on Donald Trump, and one of the things his father decided early on was to hand the empire over to him and make him the face of the empire and make all of the decisions at a very young age. And of course, it put everyone else's nose out of joint because the father made that choice. But the father made that choice because he saw that person, that individual, as the most relevant and the most worthy, and a bunch of reasons. And as much as you want to go back and forth on Donald Trump stuff, but the point was, it was a really interesting expose on the kind of thinking that was going on in the father's mind to pick that person. And to give the father credit, he made it perfectly clear to the rest of the siblings, this is my choice and this is what I want to do. So sometimes hard decisions still have to be made, and sometimes you need to be forthright about it. And I encourage my clients, if there's a situation like that where there is a different but for different children, to again just at least walk this through with the kids and have a discussion about what your thinking was, because the rationale might be something at least takes some of the tension out of the room.
Yeah. I mean, if it's relatively close, like 25 versus 30, I mean, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to treat them the same or recommend that they be treated the same, and just explain to the client, listen, if the kid at 25 is capable, there's nothing stopping, especially if you include unlimited discretion, there's nothing stopping the trustee from giving them all their share all at that age, right? So that's that. So want to talk about really there's two kinds of trusts that we can talk about for kids. And or generally for multiple people. And this is kind of a fundamental discussion that you can have with your client about these two options. One is what we call separate trusts. And this is probably the most common type of planning, where we take the residue and we split it into separate trusts for each kid, an equal, let's just assume it's an equal share. It doesn't have to be. But each child's trust in this case is a separate silo. And the needs of the other kids can't impinge on that amount that's set aside for child A, for example. Child B can't get at child A's money, and the trustee of B's trust can't get at A's money. So the needs of a particular child do not impact the other children. So that's the benefit. And if one kid's needs more money at a certain stage, well, it's going to come out of their share. It's not going to affect their siblings. And that's probably the most classic way of
Yeah.
really.
And it's really a helpful tool when you have a family operated corporations, because sometimes the individual who is in the opco, and some of the kids aren't in the opco, and so the opco child, who's day to day in the business, maybe getting a salary through the business and maybe not going to need the same draw on the trust assets as the other spouse who's chosen a career path that hasn't got the same financial success, but equal personal success, but they're making a lot less money and they're going to be drawing on the trust. So I always watch when I have a situation where I've got a family business to make sure that this is something they consider, and it allows the autonomy for each one to pick their own lane in terms of lifestyle as well.
And each person could have a different trustee as well, right? Of course, they're separate trusts in essence, right? The downside, of course, you have 3 trusts, 3 tax returns, 3 sets of accounts, 3 sets of investments. Everything's got to be siloed. There's no overlap here, right? So that's one, and that's most, as I say, most common. The other option is what I describe as a pool trust, and you'll know we give that option in eState. It's where you've got a single trust for multiple beneficiaries. And what's typical is that there's a discretionary allotment based on need or anything else that the trustee is left with, that they can give money to different people, but it's all coming out of the same pool. So in effect, if they give more money to A out of this one pool, then B and C might get less, right? And this is, and then usually at the end of the trust, it's divided among the beneficiaries, and you could at that point equalize. We see that kind of frequently. And you can also have further trusts after the main pool trust is distributed. And so this is quite common actually in some jurisdictions where they say, listen, let's have a pool trust until the youngest reaches a certain age, so that we know there's enough money there for their education and support, etc. Now, at that point, once the youngest is 20, let's say, okay, then I want it split, but I still want the separate parts to be in a separate trust and continued till each of the kids attains even a higher age, say 40. So you can blend them together. You can start with a pool trust and then have them distributed into separate trusts down the road. But this is, again, I think, a fundamental decision when you're talking about the client. We use this often where when one of the kids has significantly higher needs than the others, and you don't know exactly what their needs are, but you want to allow them access to the full pot, in essence.
So much depends on the nature of the assets and the size of it too, as well. And it's just another variable that we can at least walk through our clients and say, okay, well, what are we actually doing here? What do we anticipate? Like what he stated, of course, we can anticipate what our net is going to be, with lots of variables. So we can say, listen, if there's only $200,000 going to be left here to go into the trust, then we might want to think about it in a pooled way. We might want to think about it in a segregated way. Let's talk about it.
And what you can do is, again, starting with the premise that there's these two kinds of options, you can use them all together. You can have separate trusts and another part of the residue in a pooled trust. So you can get creative with that to achieve the goal of the client, where there's sort of special circumstances. So those are our two options. And now we're going to kind of turn to, as we talked about, there's two major things. There's the duration. First, before we get to the sort of gifting options and planning, etc., any thoughts about the duration, what you see normally in your typical kind of, what age do you typically see? Is there a way to judge that, or is there such a thing?
Yeah, it's such an interesting. I mean, it's you see hundreds of wills over our career, and you sort of see patterns. 25 for a chunk of it, 30, and then maybe 35. But you also see lots at 21. The first tranche comes out 25 and 30. I see. Again, I'll pick on you. I think you tend to be one to push it out further than I do, in terms of your numbers on recommendations. But it's such a personal situation for the clients.
Yeah, I think when I started 30 years ago, it was so much more common to see 21 or 25 as the outside. And then as life has gone on, you tend to see, people are 25. There's no way I'm giving my kids money at 25. You're not even, and so 30, and I don't think it's necessarily like, typically, and I'm just speaking personally, I would say more often than not, 30 is the age that I typically see. Extending it longer has benefits. The benefit of, I always say to clients, if you're trying to decide between, 30 and 33 or 35, go with the longer one, because they can always give the money earlier. What they can't, the trustee, we're going to build in discretion. They're going to be able to give the money earlier. What they can't do is, if at 30, the kid this is not going to do them any good, it's going to hurt them to get this money. Well, we can't hold it past that age. So that's the sort of thinking I would do. But of course, there's a downside to holding it longer, right? Longer trusts, more tax returns, the things that it tells or suggests to the child about the parents' thoughts about them and their trust of their abilities, and all of those things, the dynamics that go into that. So it's that's where clients are paying us to give advice, on things like the duration of a trust. We talked about payments out, and really there's the way I describe it and the way we do it in eState is there's two kinds. There's discretionary, which we almost always put in for kids, because we don't know what the future is going to hold. So we're going to allow discretionary payments to the trustee to allow for payments as they see fit. And then there's what we call mandatory payments, and mandatory payments are any, your classic, what you've just described in stage distributions, a portion at this age, a portion at this age, and then the balance at that age. Those payments are mandatory. The kid has to get that money at that age. So before you start building in mandatory payments, make sure that's going to be a good idea, especially if you're dealing with percentages and you're dealing with an estate that's large. A 25% distribution at 21 or 25 could be a huge number. That is, so consider using fixed numbers as opposed to percentages if that's an issue, because you can do that, of course, as well.
Yeah, historically, I've seen the growth of the size of estates, and I am seeing them pushed out higher and higher. I've seen them up to 60 years of age. But ruling from the grave. But some people have a lot of wealth. It's not a bad move for the right situation with the right kid.
And you can restrict payments, of course. You can limit it to limit the discretion that a trustee has. I'm not a huge fan of that, in a sense that we don't know what this child's needs are going to be. We don't know where they're going to be living. We don't know what their medical circumstances and health circumstances and anything. So, I'd be careful about that, I think. And of course, whenever you draft a trust, there's got to be a gift over. So make sure that, I always, of course, we want to make sure we think about that. And one of the good things, again, if you use technology, is good technology will warn you if you haven't done things right. The last thing I want to just talk about is, Ian, is the trustees for these kids' trusts. Do you have any standard sort of things you say to them, to clients when choosing a trustee, those kinds of things? So what are your thoughts?
Well, we've covered off a lot of the parameters of the appointment of executor with children. One of the things I want to walk through carefully with my clients is when you pick someone different to be the trustee, then there are consequences to that. And sometimes, and certainly in large estates, you'll see institutional trustees chosen because it allows for the transition without, over the years, with less disruption. But it's also often a helpful consideration that when the choice of the trustee is the same, they can create a lot of synergies in terms of their work. And so if you pick the right age of a person who can live out the length of the trust that's going to be sufficient, and they're properly qualified, it may be worth it as opposed to going into the institutional choice.
And especially, I mean, like, there's so many factors that go into this, and the age and the length of this trust, the likely length of the trust, so important, obviously. And so if your kids are older and there's gonna be a trust for a few years, maybe that's one thing. If the kids are very young and there's gonna be a trust till they're 35, there are other considerations there. And so, those are the realities of what we do, and why clients are coming to us for practical advice. We want to make sure that, and we've said this many times, the value that we're adding is based on advice, and not necessarily, churning out a Word document or something like that. Lots of software can do that. It's the advice that is going to be valuable now and certainly in the future. So thank you very much, Ian, for that. And I hope that was a refresher for some, and gave maybe some new ways of thinking about different options for planning for children. We'll see you again next week. Thanks everybody for being here, and we'll wish you a good weekend and see you again next week. Thanks.